Get some perspective now from Vic Fedeli. He is the Minister of Economic Development in the province. Minister Fedeli, thanks very much for being back with us. And before we talk about the reopening plans, I did want to address something we mentioned earlier in the program. Obviously, the Education Minister had come into contact with an infected person, so the Premier and the Health Minister ended up being tested. Can you give us an update on what you know about those tests?
Well, I can tell you that the Minister of Education has announced that his test was negative. And of course, that is what prompted the Premier and the Minister of Health to go and get their test. I'll leave their announcements to themselves as they make them. I know I can tell you personally, when the Premier asked for all to be tested, I went and was tested as well, just in an abundance of caution. My test came back negative as well. And I think it's just a clear signal that it's a good opportunity for all the people of Ontario, whether you're feeling symptoms or not, to be tested and be part of the data as we collect those data to help us plan our path forward.
Well, I think it kind of sets us into what you've come here to talk with us about today, which is this next stage of the reopening, which is set for Friday. And there's so many moving parts with this, right? Obviously, the concern about health, but also this desire to help the economy get back to some kind of normal. So how are you balancing all that right now?
We spend a tremendous amount of time talking to organizations around the world, looking for their best practices. There are some that are far ahead of us, some that are still quite a bit behind as the virus and the pandemic has traveled. So we have talked from our perspective, economic development perspective, to stakeholders around the world. Locally now, we've been talking with the Chief Medical Officer of Health. Always, no matter what the Premier always talks about, every single move is about health and safety, the health and well-being of all the families of Ontario. So nothing is done without the health and safety being front and center. In this area, we're now looking at stage 2 outside of the GTHA. So we've got about 24 regions to the east and west and the north of Toronto that are opening, 24 regions that'll open at 12:01. So for tomorrow morning, shopping centers in the north and the east and west will be open. Place to get your hair cut and your nail salons, those will be open. Restaurants with patios will be open. So it's the right methodical, gradual approach and the safe approach to opening our economy.
You mentioned you're having a lot of conversations with people around the world, and even this morning, Minister, the stock market seems to be reacting to the case count in the United States pushing past 2 million. I mean, there's been so much optimism around economies reopening in the U.S., and now there's this worry about this fresh wave there. I mean, what have you looked at in the U.S. when you're making determinations about a province like Ontario?
Chief Medical Officer of Health says continue physical distancing. There's a glimmer of hope, but we're not out of the woods yet, if you don't mind me mixing some metaphors here. Physical distancing, wash your hands, wear a mask, practice all of the safety precautions that you would, because we are not out of the woods yet.
Well, and I know you're not the health minister, but that of the mask, even just on a personal level, I think a lot of people feel confused. They go out, maybe they're wearing a mask, but the people around them aren't wearing a mask. Why is it that we don't just have everybody wearing masks?
Well, it is, there's some element of personal choice, but the sort of guidelines are, if you can't practice safe physical distancing, then you should be wearing a mask. So, it's your choice to wear a mask all the time or not, but in an instance where you're in a closer contact and you cannot practice safe physical distancing, the advice is that's when you should be wearing a mask. On that note, what our ministry did, we did about 2 or 3 different things that we know are required. One of the learnings we had in talking to the consuls general of the G7, you can't open without childcare. So you would have seen the announcement a couple of days ago where Ontario is opening our childcare. It's a very strict set of guidelines, very strict set of rules, but we know you can't open an economy without childcare. We know you can't open an economy without personal protective equipment. So we built a website, ontario.ca/PPE, and on it shows you where you can buy. There's about 400 different places of where you can buy personal protective equipment. Also, many chambers of commerce. I know Milton, led by MPP Parm Gill down there, put a website up. Here, I live in Corbeil, Ontario, south of North Bay. The North Bay Chamber of Commerce has a website up for their members where to buy PPE locally. So you need PPE, you need childcare, and you need to follow physical distancing and safe guidelines. So we're putting all these pieces in place. One final thing, John, the Ministry of Labor has a website as well. They have more than 100 sector-by-sector guidelines, and that was also what we felt was needed in order to open. You can go on ontario.ca/coronavirus and see the Ministry of Labor's guidelines for your sector.
It's, on the one hand, very helpful to have that level of detail. The other thing, however, that we hear, Minister, is that things just get too confusing. Do you get that feedback too?
Well, I haven't heard that feedback, and we do teleconferences from all stakeholders. Sometimes there is an overload of information, but we, in an abundance of caution, we feel that it's our duty, it's our role as government to, well, first of all, some things are mandatory. Provide those labor guidelines. It was a choice for us to put PPE directory out. We think that's a very good service. It's very critical to open the childcare. So there are a lot of moving parts. We just ask you, consult with your MPPs, consult with the website. Any ontario.ca, anything will get you to the coronavirus sites, and you can get caught up and feel comfortable knowing which stage you're in, where you're located. Rely on the website of the government to tell you where we are and when.
You're the Minister of Economic Development, and obviously you're watching the job market closely, which if things go well with this reopening, that creates a lot of opportunity. I don't have to tell you, in the province of Ontario, we in May saw something like a 13.5% unemployment rate, and we've seen more than 1 million jobs lost in that March, April, May stretch. We're talking a lot about forecasting here. You got the U.S. Federal Reserve yesterday trying to predict where the U.S. economy is going. We've had the Prime Minister saying how hard it is to sort of figure out forecasting right now, given the level of uncertainty. But I guess in a best case scenario, how much job creation do you think Ontario's economy could see if this safe and steady approach goes well?
Well, we saw in May, the auto sector went back to work. We saw retail open. Now, they weren't necessarily reflected in the June 1st numbers, but we saw construction go back to work. Only residential construction was open, was an essential service. So we saw commercial, institutional, and industrial construction go back to work. And by the time they ramped up was the end of May. Auto ramped up before the end of May. Retail had a very soft opening. It was curbside only, then doors open, and now, of course, shopping malls and others will open. So all the signs are positive. Remember, John, the middle of March when this hit, Ontario's biggest problem was we could not find 250,000 people to fill the jobs that were available that had gone unfilled. That was our single biggest economic development problem early in March. So obviously that has changed, but the fundamentals for Ontario are all still in place. We took about $5 billion out of the cost of doing business in Ontario in the last 18 months. And it's that $5 billion, the lowering of WSIB by almost 50%. Not going ahead with the previous government's tax increases, putting in an accelerated capital cost allowance, trimming red tape and removing regulations, that added up to a savings, real, true cash savings to Ontario companies of about $5 billion. That's all still in place. So we expect us to come back from this. We're stabilizing right now, but we expect us to come back strong. The Premier said we will now make things in Ontario that we have not made in a long time.